Late March 1945, the American 45th Infantry Division pushes across the Rhine and arrives at the outskirts of the picturesque Bavarian city of Aschaffenburg. With the Third Reich rapidly collapsing, the Americans expect a swift capitulation. They deliver a blunt ultimatum: surrender immediately or face absolute annihilation. They wait for the white flags to appear, but as American troops advance, they step straight into a brutal urban meat grinder. The streets erupt in a storm of lethal, coordinated resistance. Why did an outgunned garrison of old men and teenagers completely ignore military logic, defying a terrifying threat, to choose a hopeless siege over saving their own homes? The Battle of Aschaffenburg stands as a jarring reality check against the Allied illusion that the final weeks of the European war would be a simple mopping-up operation. This siege was a brutal collision between two fundamentally incompatible mindsets. On one side, General George S. Patton's Third Army employed a calculated strategy of aggressive psychological warfare. Their ultimatum was a rational military bluff designed to force a swift capitulation and conserve American blood. But this logic critically misread the environment inside the city. On the other side stood a fanaticism enforced by the executioner's rope, where a collapsing regime viewed any attempt at negotiation as high treason. The American threat of absolute destruction was met not with surrender, but with a mandate to fight to the last stone. The ensuing battle forces us to examine a chilling historical scenario. What exactly happens when a rational military ultimatum is delivered to a desperate enemy operating entirely on terror? By the spring of 1945, the Allied offensive across Western Europe had become a massive, fuel-hungry logistical tightrope. Supply lines, stretching all the way back to the French coast, were strained to their absolute limits. For American commanders, momentum was the only currency that mattered. Getting bogged down in static house-to-house fighting was a strategic failure that bled resources and gave the German High Command precious hours to reorganize. To circumvent these costly sieges, American forces had refined a doctrine of intense psychological shock. The goal was to terrify local populations and isolated garrisons into immediate submission before the first infantryman even had to kick in a door. This was a calculated, brutal pragmatism. When American mechanized columns approached a populated area, they orchestrated a demonstration of overwhelming destruction. They would encircle the perimeter, mass their artillery, and issue an uncompromising deadline. The message was explicit: capitulate or watch your ancestral homes, your churches, and your infrastructure be systematically pulverized. It was a strategy of intimidation designed to shatter the civilian will, forcing them to pressure their own military commanders into raising the white flag. Aschaffenburg seemed the perfect target for this doctrine. Situated strategically on a bend of the Main River, it was a critical geographical gateway, blocking the American thrust deeper into southern Germany. Taking the city quickly was paramount, and looking through their intelligence reports, American officers had every reason to believe the defenders would fold. The forces assigned to hold Aschaffenburg barely resembled a functional military unit. The seasoned Wehrmacht divisions had either been destroyed or pulled back eastward. Left behind was a desperate patchwork. There were recovering wounded pulled from local military hospitals, teenagers drafted directly from the Hitler Youth, and the Volkssturm, a poorly trained militia of middle-aged and elderly men holding World War I-era rifles and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons against the battle-hardened veterans of the American 45th Infantry Division. Supported by heavy armor and endless air cover, this German garrison was a statistical ghost. But military statistics cannot measure radicalized fanaticism. The defense of Aschaffenburg was handed to Major Emil Lamberth, a hardline true believer completely detached from the mathematical reality of the war. Lamberth viewed the impending collapse not as a military defeat, but as a final test of supreme ideological loyalty. He knew his militia could not win a conventional battle against American tanks, but Lamberth did not rely on tactics. He relied on absolute, paralyzing fear. This created a bizarre and tragic imbalance of power inside the city. The American commanders outside the walls believed their 155mm artillery was the most terrifying force in the equation. But for the elderly men and teenagers huddled in the cellars of Aschaffenburg, the American shells were a distant, abstract threat compared to the immediate, lethal reality of their own commanding officer. Lamberth systematically stripped away the option of surrender, turning his own garrison into hostages of a suicidal mandate. The local militia found themselves trapped in a terrifying vice, squeezed between the overwhelming mechanized might of the United States Army and the fanatical discipline enforced from within. The Americans, largely unaware of the psychological stranglehold gripping the defenders, delivered their final ultimatum. They broadcast the terms, promising absolute devastation if the city did not yield. The artillery batteries dialed in their coordinates, gunners waiting by their heavy guns. The deadline ticked closer. Along the ridges overlooking the main river, American infantrymen settled into the dirt, raised their binoculars, and watched the medieval skyline. They expected the familiar sight that had greeted them in countless other German towns, a sudden, desperate fluttering of white bedsheets from the windows. The deadline reached 0. The artillery crews held their breath. The forward observers scanned the church towers, the civic buildings, and the residential balconies. The wind blew through the quiet streets, but the stone facades remained entirely still. There were no white flags. The silence, stretching across the main river, meant only one thing: the American bluff had been called. For the commanders of the 45th Infantry Division, the calculated psychological gamble had failed instantly. The threat of absolute annihilation was not enough to break the city. Now the Americans were forced to physically execute the devastating violence they had hoped would remain just a warning. Orders echoed down the line. The infantrymen of the 157th Regiment stepped off their lines of departure and moved cautiously toward the outer suburbs of Aschaffenburg. Gripping their rifles, many soldiers still half expected the defenders to finally emerge from the shadows with their hands raised once the troops actually crossed the city limits. They assumed the sight of approaching infantry would shatter the last remaining illusions of the German garrison. Instead, the Americans walked directly into a meticulously prepared ambush. As the lead squads pushed past the initial perimeter and entered the narrow, winding cobblestone streets, the unnatural stillness violently shattered. The centuries-old medieval architecture of the city had been seamlessly weaponized. From the dark recesses of basement grates and cellar windows, the blinding exhaust flashes of Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets erupted into the streets. The crude but effective weapons struck the lead American armor, blowing tracks off tanks and immediately bottling up the mechanized columns in spaces too tight to maneuver. Simultaneously, concealed snipers positioned in elevated attic dormers and behind thick stone walls unleashed lethal, plunging fire down onto the exposed infantry. In seconds, every scenic intersection became a pre-sighted kill zone. Every narrow alleyway morphed into a fatal funnel. The 157th Infantry Regiment found itself abruptly pinned down in a claustrophobic nightmare of urban combat. The Americans quickly realized that the ragtag garrison of old men and teenagers they had dismissed on paper was fighting with a terrifying, entrenched ferocity. The rapid mechanized momentum of the American advance had violently slammed into a brick wall. The transition was immediate and brutal. A swift operational thrust had just degraded into a slow, high-casualty house-to-house siege. The psychological warfare phase was completely over. To capture Aschaffenburg, the 45th Division would have to bleed for every single block. The combat manual for the European theater dictated rapid flanking maneuvers and sweeping armored advances, but the layout of Aschaffenburg forced a brutal, linear slog. As the men of the 157th Infantry Regiment pushed deeper into the city, the fundamental nature of the war shifted from open field tactics to intimate, close-quarters extermination. The Americans quickly realized that advancing down the open cobblestone streets was suicide, a fatal funnel perfectly sighted by hidden German marksmen. Instead, they were forced to move through the architecture itself. Infantry squads employed a grueling tactic known as mouse-holing, utilizing heavy explosives to blast physical holes through the interior walls of adjoining row houses. They moved blindly from living room to living room, clearing each dark space with fragmentation grenades and submachine gun fire before blowing a hole into the next property. When a heavily fortified building refused to yield to infantry assault, the specialized tools of urban destruction were brought forward. 10-pound canvas satchel charges became the standard key to open locked doors and collapse stubbornly defended stairwells. Where thick stone prevented explosive entry, combat engineers stepped up to the line, wielding M2 flamethrowers. They sent thick, rolling jets of ignited liquid fuel into basement grates and ground floor windows, sucking the oxygen out of the enclosed spaces and forcing the defenders out into the open sights of American riflemen. When small arms and fire were not enough, Sherman tanks were called up from the rear. In open terrain, a tank is a weapon of rapid maneuver. In these narrow streets, it became a stationary, vulnerable pillbox, tasked with firing high-explosive 75mm shells at point-blank range into storefronts and residential facades. The American advance was no longer measured in miles per day, but in bloody yards per hour. With every single block taken, the historic Bavarian architecture was systematically reduced to pulverized stone and smoking timber. It was a methodical, exhausting deconstruction of a city. The American infantrymen were forced to dismantle Aschaffenburg brick by brick, entirely abandoning the hope of a swift capture in favor of a slow, grinding fight for survival. Across the front line, sometimes separated by no more than a burning courtyard or a collapsed staircase, the German defenders were actively adapting to this terrifying onslaught. Initially, there had been a profound miscalculation among the local garrison regarding American resolve. Many defenders, recognizing the cultural and historical significance of their city, believed the Americans would hesitate to completely obliterate it. They assumed the heavy stone facades of Aschaffenburg's civic buildings and centuries-old cellars would provide a permanent sanctuary, forcing the attackers into a cautious, negotiated standoff. But as the point-blank tank fire systematically dismantled their defensive perimeters, that illusion vanished. The Americans were clearly willing to level the entire city to secure the crossing. Yet, as the artillery rained down, the defenders quickly realized that the very destruction being inflicted upon them was creating an even more formidable defensive landscape. Thick medieval masonry, once shattered, did not simply disappear. It collapsed into dense, impassable mounds of jagged stone, twisted iron, and splintered timber that completely blocked American vehicles and offered incredible concealment. A destroyed, pancaked building was often far more difficult to capture than an intact one. The Volkssturm militiamen and Hitler Youth utilized these fresh ruins with lethal efficiency. They burrowed deep into the subterranean vaulted cellars originally built to store wine and beer, waiting out the heaviest American bombardments in relative safety. When the artillery lifted and the American infantry moved forward, these defenders would emerge through the dust of the rubble, taking up hidden positions in the skeletal remains of second-story floors to fire down on the exposed troops. By utilizing the sheer mass of the collapsed architecture, they had successfully neutralized the overwhelming American mechanized advantage, pulling the battle down into a primitive, intimate struggle in the dirt. But this sudden tactical resilience was not born of high morale, patriotic fervor, or a genuine belief in ultimate victory. The glue holding the crumbling German line together was pure, undiluted terror, meticulously engineered by the garrison commander, Major Emil Lamberth. As the American pressure intensified and the horrific reality of the urban meat grinder became clear, the natural human instinct for self-preservation began to surface among the defenders. Older men of the Volkssturm, realizing the absolute futility of fighting Sherman tanks with outdated bolt-action rifles, whispered in the cellars of slipping away in the night or quietly raising a white flag when the Americans approached their specific sector. Lamberth anticipated this inevitable collapse in morale and moved swiftly to crush it before it could spread. He instituted a ruthless, inescapable regime of internal enforcement, deploying flying drumhead courts-martial, the infamous Standgericht, to patrol the shrinking German perimeter. These heavily armed squads of loyalists had a singular, terrifying mandate: absolute obedience or immediate death. Anyone caught attempting to surrender, abandoning their assigned post, or even voicing defeatism to a comrade was summarily executed on the spot. There were no official trials, no written appeals, and absolutely no consideration given for age, injury, or physical exhaustion. To ensure the message resonated through every dark cellar and fortified bunker, Lamberth ordered the bodies of the executed to be left hanging in plain sight. Across the city, corpses were left dangling from lampposts, residential balconies, and the remaining limbs of shattered trees. Crudely painted wooden placards were hung around their necks, branding them as cowards, traitors to the Reich, and warnings to anyone who dared to lay down their arms. For the terrified conscripts holding the line, The visual arithmetic was undeniable and paralyzing. The Americans were a dangerous, heavily armed enemy approaching from the outside, but Lamberth's executioners were already inside the room with them. Surrender meant a guaranteed, shameful death by hanging. Fighting the Americans offered a slim, agonizing chance of survival in the rubble. Back at the headquarters of the American 45th Infantry Division, the daily casualty reports filtering back from the front lines were generating deep alarm. The operation that was originally planned as a rapid securing of a river crossing had rapidly devolved into a lethal stalemate, consuming infantry squads at an entirely unsustainable rate. General George S. Patton's Third Army operated on a strict doctrine of momentum. Every single day spent bogged down in the streets of Aschaffenburg gave retreating German forces elsewhere the precious time they desperately needed to establish new defensive lines further east. The tactical deadlock had to be broken immediately, and the American command made a cold, calculated operational decision. If the German garrison would not yield the buildings to infantry, the buildings would simply be removed from the map. The previous restrictions on heavy ordnance were completely lifted. The Americans shifted away from localized precision infantry support to a doctrine of systematic grid-by-grid bombardment of the entire city. Batteries of 155mm long tom artillery pieces were massed on the elevated ridges outside the city limits, pouring relentless, high-explosive barrages directly into the urban center. The sky above Aschaffenburg tore open as flights of P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers descended on the city, dropping heavy 500-pound bombs and strafing the narrow streets with 50-caliber machine gun fire. The earth shook continuously under the weight of the ordnance. The air grew thick with a choking, impenetrable curtain of pulverized brick dust, shattered mortar, and acrid cordite that physically blocked out the spring sun. The American strategy had shifted from a surgical infantry assault to a campaign of total architectural erasure. They were no longer trying to capture Aschaffenburg intact. They were systematically flattening the city to the ground in order to save the lives of their own advancing soldiers. Underneath this apocalyptic continuous bombardment, the German defense was finally beginning to physically disintegrate, not from a lack of fear, but from a total lack of logistics. The relentless day and night American pressure meant that ammunition consumption far exceeded the meager, isolated stockpiles hidden within the city's cellars. Machine gun belts ran completely empty. The supply of Panzerfaust rockets, the only weapon that had effectively held the American armor at bay in the narrow streets, dwindled down to nothing. For the surviving Volkssturm militiamen and the drafted Hitler Youth, the harsh physical reality of their situation became inescapable. They were completely cut off from any hope of resupply, entirely out of ammunition, and being slowly buried alive under the collapsing weight of their own historic city. In any conventional military doctrine, this is the exact moment an organized surrender takes place to prevent a useless, one-sided massacre, but Lamberth's terror apparatus continued to function with terrifying mechanical efficiency, completely insulated from the tactical reality on the ground. The threat of the executioner's noose remained exponentially stronger than the logical necessity of capitulation. Forced forward by the roaming execution squads, the defenders retreated deeper into the shattered, smoking remains of the city center. Stripped of their heavy weapons, they fought with scavenged rifles, captured grenades, and bayonets from behind the smoking piles of rubble, defending crushed intersections and collapsed storefronts with an empty, hollow desperation. The battle had reached its most grueling, primitive phase, a blind, desperate struggle over a completely unrecognizable wasteland of broken stone. But beneath the surface of this fanatical defense, a tragic reality about the city's own population is completely hidden from the American guns. While the American artillery battered the surface, a very different struggle unfolded in the pitch-black cellars. Historical records shatter the myth of a unified, defiant Aschaffenburg. The local civilian population had no desire to fight. They watched their historic homes burn and desperately wanted to capitulate, begging the military command to accept the American ultimatum before the bombers erased their city. But they were effectively held hostage by Major Lamberth and his loyalist officers, the same execution squads that kept the militia in the trenches, now turned their weapons on the populace. Any civilian attempting to hang a white sheet or approach American lines was branded a traitor and faced the executioner's rope. The American command outside the city slowly grasped the chilling reality of their tactical gridlock. Their initial psychological warfare had not forced a surrender. Instead, it had inadvertently trapped thousands of civilians inside a sealed kill zone, caught between American high explosives and radicalized hangmen. This presented a grim moral and tactical dilemma for the 45th Infantry Division. They were obliterating a city full of people who actively wanted to surrender, simply because it was an unavoidable necessity to root out the suicidal garrison holding them captive. Yet the operational timeline offered no room for prolonged negotiations. The American offensive had to move forward, and the infantry was bleeding heavily in the rubble. With no other option to break the fanatical deadlock and save their own advancing soldiers, the American commanders made a brutal calculation. They ordered a final, deafening crescendo of destruction. By the first days of April, the American assault concentrated on the final German stronghold, the massive 17th-century Johannisburg Castle overlooking the river. The 45th Infantry Division halted its agonizing block-by-block advance and let the heavy weapons take over completely. Division artillery, reinforced by Corps-level 155mm batteries and relentless fighter-bomber strikes, unleashed a concentrated firestorm on the shrinking defensive pocket. The sprawling Renaissance palace, built of thick red sandstone, was rapidly transformed into a towering trap. Hundreds of high-explosive shells struck the castle and the surrounding downtown core every single hour. Roofs caved in, bringing tons of heavy masonry, shattered slate, and burning timber down upon the defenders trapped below. The sheer concussive force of the bombardment liquefied the remaining German perimeter, physically burying the last desperate pockets of resistance under the weight of their own historic monuments. Inside the suffocating, dust-choked bunkers beneath the ruins, the fanatical grip of Major Emil Lamberth finally shattered. His brutal terror apparatus, which had successfully forced a militia of old men and teenagers into a suicidal standoff, could no longer function in a command structure that had physically ceased to exist. There were no telephone lines left to issue orders, no ammunition to distribute, and no intact positions to defend. The earth-shattering reality of American firepower had finally eclipsed the psychological fear of the executioner's rope. On April 3, 1945, facing total physical annihilation, and with his garrison entirely incapable of returning fire, the uncompromising commander broke. Lamberth authorized the white flags to be raised, formally surrendering the devastated remnants of Aschaffenburg. The relentless, deafening roar of artillery that had pounded the valley for days abruptly stopped. In its place, an eerie, ringing silence settled over the bend in the main river. American infantrymen cautiously climbed out of their fortified basement positions and stepped out into the open. They walked through a smoldering, unrecognizable wasteland of pulverized brick, twisted iron, and drifting ash. As they disarmed the exhausted survivors and surveyed the staggering scale of the structural leveling, the victors were left to wander through the smoke and measure the true, devastating cost of their psychological bluff. When the 45th Infantry Division first arrived on the outskirts of Aschaffenburg days earlier, their threat of absolute annihilation was intended as a calculated bluff. It was a rational maneuver designed to force capitulation and bypass an urban meat grinder. Standing in the pulverized ruins, the infantrymen could see the United States Army was fully capable of making good on that terrifying promise. The historic skyline was gone, replaced by endless mounds of shattered masonry and splintered timber. But as a tool of psychological warfare, the tactic had been a catastrophic failure. The American strategy relied on the assumption that a trapped enemy would instinctively choose survival over total destruction. It appealed to conventional military logic, but that logic completely disintegrated when it collided with the irrationality of a dying, terror-based state. The ultimatum could not penetrate the localized tyranny of a regime that weaponized fear against its own people. The defenders did not hold out due to superior tactics or patriotic bravery. They fought because the radicalized commanders inside the city made the act of surrendering far more immediately terrifying than the rain of high explosives falling from the outside. This brutal siege stands as a grim case study in the absolute limits of conventional intimidation. The smoldering ruins of the Johannisburg Castle and the thousands of artillery craters scarring the devastated streets held one final harsh truth about the endgame of the European war. The American ultimatum delivered at the gates of Aschaffenburg was a rational, calculated attempt to prevent a senseless slaughter by appealing to the basic human instinct for survival. But in the suffocating, violent twilight of the Third Reich, that conventional strategy completely unraveled. The ultimate threat of death from an invading army proved entirely meaningless to men who had already been commanded to die by their own collapsing regime.